Thank you to our presenters for those really engaging presentations. I have a feeling there are a lot of questions, so we'll just get right started.
For Dr. Sun, I'd like to know how you and Carla came to be.
How did we get to meet? It was in 2015, and a reporter from the Spokane newspaper phoned me one day. She was doing a story about Carla, profile on Carla, and wanted some historical background. I had not met Carla at that point, but when I read the article, so I gave my general comments about rescue, but the story that came out was so interesting that I decided to contact Carla and ask if she would come to Washington State to visit my class. She was gracious and came, and was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. So,
many hours of interview, like
many hours, yes.
32 or something.
Carla, I had a somewhat similar experience. My father told me when I was 4, "You're a Jew, don't ever tell anybody." That was in Vancouver, Canada, and I lived in terror of Jews finding out who I was, and Gentiles as well. And so when I was 23, I told my roommate that I was Jewish, and he convinced me that I should become Catholic to save my eternal soul. And I was looking for a place to feel that I belonged somewhere. And I became a Catholic, and I worked at it very diligently. I went to church weekly, and I went to confession, and I did everything. And so anyway, after a year, I was rescued by a Gentile who understood anti-Semitism better than anybody I'd ever known. And I was able to leave all that behind me, thankfully. But my question is, after I no longer pursued my Catholic religion, I realized that the Catholics never actually saw me as a Catholic. They saw me as a converted Jew. I was a trophy. Jews who become Catholics, that's the best thing that Catholics can do. And I was wondering, did they know of your Jewish heritage, and did you have any sense that you were similarly perceived?
I never talked about the background, so even my kids didn't know very much. I always felt Jewish, and I always missed it. And so I was glad to be able to go back. It was about 40 years, not 50, but my husband and I left the Netherlands I left in 1948, he left in 1947. So coming to the States, people really didn't know it at all. And then from there we went actually to West Africa. We lived 5 years in Liberia, where my children were born, and also people did not know anything about my background. So that my life was a bit different as far as that is concerned. Does that answer your question? I think once they knew that I was Jewish before, that they considered me. And I became Catholic really to get away from Judaism, but I really never did get away. I mean, in my mind and heart.
Hi, I have a question about the McClellans, and I was wondering if you could speak specifically about their story, why, they went to this place and they were kind of tasked with it. How did they come to be tasked? How did they interpret their mission and their work? And you talk about the networks and kind of the institutions, and what about the individuals, right? Because they went kind of from place to place together, and I'm imagining there were other people that kind of were working in these circles, going to place, so kind of what motivated them, and how did they, they spent a long time during the war in Europe, and they didn't have to, right?
Right, so it really starts with Marjorie, who came from a Quaker family, and she was a social worker, and so she was a kindergarten teacher in New York, and when she met Ross, and she came from a family that were very involved with Quakerism, and there is a large emphasis on social justice within Quakerism. And her father was a professor at Yale, and he was active in the AFSC. So that is that connection. So she met Ross. Ross was not a Quaker initially. He was a graduate student at Columbia learning French. And through Marjorie, the reason he became interested in traveling abroad is twofold. One is he really liked Marjorie, and they would ultimately get married. And two, as the war broke out in Europe, the AFSC in Europe was starting to look for people within the U.S. who would be willing to go serve to help with the refugee crisis. And they looked to the McClellans because of Ross's foreign language skills. And so the offer that they made to him was, go to Rome for a little while, and then you can go study French in France. And he was taken with that idea. And so once they got there, these plans were abandoned. Ross never finished because they were so taken with service work. And after the war, they stayed in Geneva, and he took a job with the State Department, which is where he worked until he retired.
Mrs. Pepperzak, it's an honor and a pleasure to be in the audience when you speak. We thank you for being here.
I guess I'm just lucky, right?
As you watch the world today, what message would you have for our young people?
You know, my message, if it could be like that, is that parents teach their children love instead of hate. And I think it often, children are so, they don't really know which direction to go, and that would be ideal, but it's not happening. And all what I can say is that we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about the terrible things which happened, and that we hope that it will never happen again. But we have to teach our young people, and we have actually to teach our university students, because I think if we can just let them know how terrible it can be in this world. I am concerned, very concerned, because the anti-Semitism and the white supremacists, it doesn't help us. But hopefully, I always have, when I was young and I was during the war, I was always hopeful because of my age, I think. I knew that it was so bad, the Nazi government, and it did such an atrocious thing that just couldn't last. And I hope now too that somehow the world will change again. And I think we all have to do our best to try to live correctly and to teach our young people and our friends. Thank you.
First of all, these were 3 very fine papers, so thank you for that. But I too have a question for Carla Pepperzak. I'm quite amazed by all of your story, but 2 elements in what Ray Sun told us intrigue me in particular. One is, how did you get that German nurse's uniform, and did you feel that you were in danger of being caught out, that it wasn't really yours? That's one question. And more interesting to me, how did you bicycle 60 miles and also bring children to safe houses or other things that you might have needed to bring along? Did you have a wagon in back? Did the others ride a bicycle? Did you go 60 miles there and back in one day? Did you stay overnight? Those, I know that the Dutch are very good on the bicycle. You must have been fantastic.
Well, to ask your last question, answer first, I don't think 50 miles on one day, we talk about kilometers. And actually, maybe 30 at the most back and forth, but not too much more. But, you know, then I will try. We had sort of an underground people. I knew some of them, and I could stay the night and went back. As far as taking children to safe houses, we one at a time, and usually we took a train or a bus if it could be done, because a child didn't have to have the star and didn't so that we. Once in a while on the bike, I put it on the back of the bike, but not that often. And your first question was...
German uniform?
Well, I was studying medical technology, and so I had to do practice work in hospitals and laboratories, and that's how I got that. And I bought the uniform. The paper I stole.
In your movement about, were you in greater fear of German patrols and investigating your papers, or in greater fear of Dutch informers and that somebody would turn you in?
I think I was in greater fear of being caught by German. But of course we were very, very careful, and you know, not to be betrayed, because that's how most Jewish people, those, especially those in hiding, were betrayed. But the Nazi government offered everybody a certain amount of money for every Jew they turned in. And it was quite substantial, you know, like 100 guilders at the time, something like that, which was at the time lots of money. So that was it was not so much it was the Dutch Nazis one had to be careful for. There were quite a few at the time. You spoke Dutch?
Ja, ik
Sorry, I couldn't understand what you were saying, maar ik versta Hollands fluent.
Spreekt u nog goed Hollands?
Ja.
Ik wil u iets vragen. Hoe is het gegaan in de winter of 1944?
Ja.
De hongerwinter. Dat was afschuwelijk. Want ik ben geboren in 1944. En mijn moeder heeft mij veel verteld van... Ik ben in Utrecht geboren, niet Amsterdam. Maar ik heb altijd veel interesse gehad. En ik bedank u voor uw brave werk. Hartelijk bedankt.
Tot uw dienst.
I don't know enough Dutch, but I'm thinking that you said that you owe her thanks because you were born in 1945, 44. Because your mother was saved by... So there you go.
I don't remember.
I really want to ask you how you survived during that hunger winter. The winter of 44 was immensely cold, and people were absolutely going around scouring the countryside for anything and everything. And many people in that part of Holland, Amsterdam, North Holland, they were not rescued immediately from the American or the Canadian troops, who all did more in the south. And the German resistance was horrible. And they could confiscate any food from you, and there was blackout in the evening. You couldn't be found on the streets, so...
And there was no electricity, very little water. What really happened when the Normandy invasion took place and the Allied army went north, they were stopped at the big rivers, the city of Arnhem. There have been books written about this, and there has been a movie, I think A Bridge Too Far, where the northern part of the Netherlands was not liberated until 6 months, or one was in October and the other one, they were not liberated until May 1945. and the countryside was flooded by the Germans, so airplanes couldn't land. And so whatever crops there was not much left except for sugar beets. And there was no heat, so you had to use charcoal. They used charcoal between the railroad tracks, and from the Jewish homes they would take all the wood, and there were no trees left in Amsterdam because they cut all the trees for the use of wood. Tot u dient.
I think that's a nice way to end this wonderful panel. And our sincere thanks to Mrs. Pepperzak for being willing to make the journey over the Cascades. And I'm sure I have a lot of students that came from my class, and they might want to come up and shake your hand, if that's okay. And so why don't we take a short break, and we can thank the panel.
There will be some students coming to meet you.